Maverick News. The world is watching. In a universe full of ideas, we draw lightness from the dark to a place where opposites attract. Right meets left, positive touches negative, sparking an explosion of truth. Because politics makes strange bedfellows.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Strange Bedfellows, episode 28. I'm your host, Lori Spencer. My usual co-host, Rick Walker of Maverick News, is taking the night off. It's been a long week in the news business and pretty much everywhere, but I have a wonderful guest that I want you all to meet tonight. I've actually been looking forward to meeting her for couple of years now that we've been Twitter friends, and I've been a fan of reading her work and her blog. She's a history blogger and a really, really smart lady with so much insight into what's happening in the world. Her name is Naomi Allen, and she's joining us all the way from South Africa, where it is early pre-dawn hours. Naomi, thank you for getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to join us on Strange Bedfellows. How are you, my friend?
It's my pleasure to be here. I'm glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to talk to you for the first time
face to face.
Yes, exactly. As face to face as we can get.
So we're going to talk about Israel on trial at the International Court of Justice at The Hague. That is also continuing this week. And of course, South Africa is the country that's bringing the case for genocide at the ICJ. So you were telling me recently about not only the political situation there in South Africa, but the economic situation and the crime situation. I think you told me that you are basically providing nighttime security for your whole neighborhood. And you're also dealing with frequent power outages and the grid's always going down. Your internet goes down a lot. So if we lose you during the show, let's just hope the internet stays on long enough to finish the interview. But tell me a little bit about the situation in South Africa right now and what you're living with, and where exactly are you in South Africa?
Well, I'm in KwaZulu-Natal. I don't want to say exactly where.
Yeah, there you go. Don't give your address.
Well, I'm not providing security for the whole neighborhood. There's a neighborhood watch, and we work together. But yeah, I'm like hyper aware and run a community volunteer community watch because we don't have any cops.
Wow.
We have no cops in our city. And the power problem is something that's just a normal thing.
That's normal?
It's normal.
Wow.
Yeah. So some days you'll have 12 hours of electricity. Sometimes every 4 or 6 hours you'll have an outage. Sometimes you won't have power for like 4 days to a whole week.
That's got to be an adjustment for an American.
Yeah,
to live like that.
It took a while for me to get used to it. It was more difficult to deal with the water situation. So
you're without water too sometimes?
When we first got here, we didn't have water for 3 weeks.
Wow.
And I got fed up with it, so we dug a well. We took a chance and dug a well. And it took a long time for us to do it, but now I don't have any water problems. But I'm lucky. Most people around here still have to deal with water issues. And the people here, before the war started in Gaza, used to compare their water and electricity problems to like, hey, we live like the people in Gaza do.
I was going to say, yeah, it sounds like Gaza.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, anyways,
So tell me about the political situation in South Africa and what led South Africa to level charges of genocide against Israel at the International Court of Justice.
um, South Africa's relationship and affection for Palestine has existed for a very long time.
True.
So when Israel first became a state, they tried to be friends with everybody in Africa. They saw all of the emerging countries in Africa as basically like them, a new country who had shaken off foreign oppressors, shaken off colonization, and they tried to be friends with all of the countries in on the continent. And it was working out pretty well for a bit, um, except back then, because it was apartheid, they were critical of the apartheid government. Okay, so the ANC people were cool with Israel back then. They saw them as a fellow liberated nation back then.
Makes sense.
But then the Suez Canal crisis happened. Okay, and they invaded, Gaza and Egypt, and then there was a 6-day war, and they invaded the West Bank. Now it's a little bit more complicated about how they ended up
complicated.
about how they ended up occupying us. But right after the 6-day war happened, prior to this, Israel was leaning toward the Soviet bloc.
Correct.
It was they had socialist tendencies. The Soviet bloc helped them win their independence by smuggling weapons and planes into the country. If it wasn't for Czechoslovakia,
Israel would not exist today.
No, Israel would not exist.
Right.
So they had a special relationship with the Soviet bloc. Okay.
In the beginning,
then,
yes,
in the beginning. But then when the Suez Canal crisis happened, the Soviet Union threw Israel under the bus.
That's right.
In order to make friends with Egypt. And I don't know what choice they had but to lean west at that time. France and England went ahead and invaded Egypt. And what choice did Israel have at that time? Because they needed,
an ally.
They needed an access to that canal, and they needed allies. Otherwise, their economy was going to be devastated. But the Soviet Union totally threw them under the bus, and then the war started with Jordan. Right. Now, everybody treats that whole thing as one war, but it's actually two different wars.
Explain that, would you?
Well, the war with Egypt was about the Suez Canal. But the war with Jordan was about the Palestinian... I'm sorry, the birds are messing with me here.
They see the light, right?
Yeah. The Palestinian radicals, the Husseinites in the West Bank, wouldn't stop attacking Israel.
And that takes us to that very interesting point in the Cold War when alliances in the Middle East shifted. Like you said earlier, originally it was the Soviet Union that strongly supported Israel in 1948. And then that changed during the Cold War when Israel and the United States came closer together, which then forced the Soviets to forge an alliance with their former enemies, the Arabs, the Palestinians who had fought against them with Hitler in World War II. Then they end up climbing into bed with them.
No, I kind of disagree in the order of that. I don't think that the Soviets turned their backs on Israel after they formed an alliance with the United States. The Soviet Union turned their backs on Israel first. over the Suez Canal because they saw what Egypt was doing to take that Suez Canal away from that Western company, as something that was going to lead to a revolution in the Middle East, where the European countries were going to learn, like they're the dependent people for the oil, etc., etc. So they were the ones who turned their backs on Israel first, and that is what turned Israel toward the United States. That's
Right.
what happened, in my opinion. That's how I
So
think it happened, in my opinion.
let's try to tie the past to the present right now. Do you think that, since October 7th, we've seen the long friendship that was enjoyed by Israel and Russia? They had a special relationship. Putin and Netanyahu had kind of a bromance going. But that all changed after October the 7th, right? And now it appears that Russia is obviously once again throwing Israel.
It's my alarm.
Wow.
Those are called party dogs. Yeah, they do that every morning.
It's daybreak there. Are they just crowing the
Yeah.
dawn, the rising sun? It's so cool.
What's it called? A ibis? They're very ancient birds.
And very loud. They drowned me out. I don't know if you even heard my question. You probably didn't. But basically the question was, do you think that Putin right now and Russia are doing the same thing that they did during the Cold War in their relationship with the terrorist organizations, the Palestinian Liberation Movement? By supporting that, do you think that they are throwing Israel and the Jews under the bus once again?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that Putin and the whole government, they're playing politics right now for the sake of BRICS and trying to appear, neutral. But they say some very important things. They do defend the legitimacy of the Israeli state. They do believe that Israel has a right to defend themselves. And they have made a comment. Lavrov said that Israel was born. Can you hear me? Israel was born, out of need because of the Holocaust, etc., etc. And they've said things like, lost my train of thought here. Oh, that, okay, as an occupier, they don't have a right to defend themselves, but they do have a right to defend themselves against terrorism. So they're kind of playing both sides, but I don't think that they'll throw Israel under the bus.
I don't know. I'm going to play you a clip. This is from the International Criminal Court this week. On Wednesday, Russia really unloaded on Israel here, and I want you to hear the testimony. Basically, this week, we heard, or we're in the process of hearing from 50 different countries making their arguments to the International Court. This is what Russia had to say.
Israel shall terminate its breaches of international law. It must, in particular, cease all settlement activities and all other activities that impede reaching a final status agreement. At the same time, discussion on Israel's responsibility must remain within the limits imposed by the advisory nature of these proceedings. tragic events of the 7th of October cannot justify the collective punishment of more than 2 million Gazans. We cannot accept the logic of those officials in Israel and some Western countries who try to defend the indiscriminate violence against civilians by referring to Israel's duty to protect its nationals. Violence can only lead to more violence. Hatred brings hatred. This vicious circle must be broken. In Russia's view, security both for Israel and the Palestinians can only be ensured if the root cause of the current crisis is addressed. Outbreaks of violence will inevitably occur again until the Palestinian people, having suffered for decades from injustice, exercises its right to establish an independent state. That state, in accordance with the Security Council and General Assembly resolutions, is to emerge within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Only this approach, based on international law, can bring a lasting peace for the region and security for Palestinians and Israelis alike. It is one of the foundations of the United Nations, mentioned in the very first article of its charter. Every state has the duty to refrain from any forcible action which deprives peoples of their right to self-determination. Meanwhile, as recognized by the General Assembly, the protracted Israeli occupation prevents the Palestinians from implementing that right. An end to the Israeli occupation has been identified as a goal for the international community by legally binding resolutions of the Security Council, including Resolution 2334. Israel is accordingly under an obligation to cease its violations of international law and to allow the Palestinian people to establish an independent state. This necessarily means that the occupation must come to an end. The other key problem that leads to continuous violations of human rights of Palestinians are the Israeli settlement activities. This policy, sometimes referred to as creation of facts on the ground, was launched back in 1967 and has led to progressive shrinking of Palestinian lands. This has effectively undermined prospects of a negotiated solution of the one element of the final status, namely the issues of territory and borders. The overall number of Israeli settlers in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is over 700,000. The situation is exacerbated by other arbitrary moves by the Israeli authorities. This court, in its advisory opinion on the wall, recognized that the Israeli settlement in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, had been established in breach of international law. As explained in that advisory opinion, the settlements are contrary to the principle of inadmissibility of acquisition of territory by force. They also contradict the provisions of the Fourth Geneva Convention, prohibiting transfers of population and deportations from an occupied territory. Resolutions of the Security Council have characterized that policy as changing the legal status. Many examples have been provided by other delegations here. The Russian Federation expects the court to give them due consideration. Mr. President, members of the court, the question before us, therefore, the legal consequences of those violations. The starting point here is the well-established rule whereby every internationally wrongful act of a state entails the international responsibility of that state. In the present proceedings, the court will be right to conclude that Israel's violations result in Israel's duty to comply with the obligations it had breached to put an end to its ongoing violations and to provide reparation for the damage caused. This means, first and foremost, that Israel is under an international legal obligation to respect the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and to stop all settlement activities in the occupied territory. Given the particular legal framework in the Middle East peace process, Israel is also under an obligation to cease all activities
Now that's interesting to me, Naomi. The argument that Russia makes, it's the Palestinian argument that these territories were acquired by use of force. To me, that's called winning a war. Ask Poland how they felt after World War II when Russia took over their country. The Soviet Union certainly did the same thing in Europe after World War II. It happens in every war. It happened in Palestine. That's how the British Mandate came to be after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire was defeated. That's how the West Bank and Gaza came to be under the control of Israel. Basically, the Arabs started a war. They lost, and they lost some territory, and now they cry that their land was stolen from them. Well, that's what happens in a war. Am I wrong?
Well, after the 6-Day War, the treaties that were drawn up between Israel and Egypt and Israel and Jordan, they actually gave Israel administrative control of those regions.
Correct.
And the territories between Jordan and Israel were the old board for the Palestinian Mandate, and the same with Egypt. So they basically ceded that land to Israel, but Israel never bothered to annex it. So they just kind of fell into a black hole, and they're like no man's land. They never wanted to keep those countries. If they had just went ahead and annexed it right away, we wouldn't have all these problems. But
Good
they
point.
didn't want those countries. They didn't want the West Bank. They didn't want Gaza because it was full of terrorists. Egypt didn't want them either. Jordan didn't want them either.
They still don't.
And
their borders are closed to the Palestinians.
The reason they didn't want them was because they couldn't control them. They kept trying to overthrow their own governments. And Israel was like, Jordan, these are your people. They were Jordanian citizens. If you don't control them, we're going to bomb you. And that's exactly how the war with Jordan started.
What happened? Yep.
And so what did Jordan do? Oh, well, here, you take them. And that's, the Oslo Accords were supposed to transition them to that point. But they're Nazis. What do? You can't reason with Nazis. They only want one thing, the destruction of Israel.
Right.
They don't want their own state.
And by the way,
they had their own state. They had their own state. It was Jordan. They had their Arab state.
That's right. And for people who say, for 2 years, you and I have both been attacked by the NAFO trolls and those who say there are no Nazis in Ukraine, right? The Banderites are gone. It has nothing to do with their World War II alliance, blah, 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 blah. And we've, definitively shown that that's not true. Now we're getting attacked for saying that there are Nazis in Palestine and then the Hamas guys practice Nazi ideology. And this photo, I don't know if you saw this. This just popped up this week. Right there.
Mm-hmm.
See the tattoo?
Well, you know what? They don't care anymore. Oh, I heard all about that El Husseini guy and that they're Nazis. I don't care. It doesn't matter. What matters is what is going on today, the genocide that Israel is carrying out.
That's what they say. But getting back to Russia, I do want to talk about the anniversary of the war and sort of tying this all together, if the bird will let me talk.
Russia better watch out, because the arguments that they're making against Israel right now also applies to what they're doing in Ukraine.
I tend to agree with that. I mean, the reasons that Putin gave for invading Ukraine, two reasons.
Mm-hmm.
One, of course, was that the oppressed Russian-speaking people who consider themselves to be Russians in eastern Ukraine were being shelled and genocided, 14,000 of them killed by the Ukrainian Nazis over a 10-year period or 8-year period before Putin finally felt like he had no choice but to invade and to fight. And the second reason that he gives, of course, is the denazification of Ukraine. And on that, I agree with Putin. I think he's right. And just to refresh your memory, this is what he just told Tucker Carlson about it.
The president of Ukraine stood up with the entire Parliament of Canada and applauded this man. How can this be imagined? The president of Ukraine himself, by the way, is a Jew by nationality.
Really, my question is, what do you do about it? I mean, Hitler's been dead for 80 years. Nazi Germany no longer exists. And so, true. And so I think what you're saying is you want to extinguish or at least control Ukrainian nationalism.
And, the Ukrainian nationalists, this is also something that Putin said, and I think he said it very, very well. Take a look.
Основные боестолкновения российской армии, как и ожидалось, происходят не с регулярными частями вооруженных сил Украины, а с националистическими формированиями, которые, как известно, и несут прямую ответственность за геноцид на Донбассе и кровь мирных граждан народных республик. Кроме того, националистические элементы, внедренные в состав регулярных украинских частей, не только подстрекают их к оказанию вооруженного сопротивления, но по сути играют и роль заградотрядов. Более того, по имеющейся информации, и это подтверждается результатами объективного контроля, мы видим это. Бендеровцы и неонацисты выставляют тяжелое вооружение, в том числе системы залпового огня, прямо в центральных районах крупных городов, включая Киев и Харьков. Они планируют вызвать ответный огонь российских ударных комплексов по жилым кварталам. По сути, они действуют так же, как и террористы во всем мире. Прикрываются людьми в надежде затем обвинить Россию в жертвах среди мирного населения. Достоверно известно, что все это происходит по рекомендации иностранных консультантов, прежде всего американских советников. Еще раз обращаюсь к военнослужащим вооруженных сил Украины. Не позволяйте неонацистам и бендеровцам использовать ваших детей, ваших жен и стариков в качестве живого щита. Берите власть в свои руки. Похоже, нам с вами будет легче договориться, чем с этой шайкой наркоманов и неонацистов, которая засела в Киеве и взяла в заложники весь украинский народ. Также хочу дать самую высокую оценку действиям российских солдат и офицеров. Они действуют мужественно, профессионально, героически, выполняя свой воинский долг, успешно решают важнейшую задачу по обеспечению безопасности нашего народа и нашего Отечества.
So, what he just said, and that was to justify the invasion 2 years ago that started on this date. I hear that's a speech that could have been given last week by Benjamin Netanyahu. He's basically saying, look, we've got enemies on our borders. They're Nazis. They've always been Nazis. They want to kill every single one of us. They've been attacking us for years with rockets. After October 7th, they invaded us. These terrorists came in and killed our people. We are defending our people. And indeed, Israel is like little Russia over there in the Middle East, right? You've got so many Russian Jews that now live in Israel. Many of them hold dual citizenship. They vote in Russian elections. And Putin has always been very popular in Israel.
Yeah.
In I guess the last elections in 2018, he won 73% of the Russian-Israeli vote. Israel has kind of stayed out of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Obviously, they have issues with the Nazis in Ukraine. They don't want to support them. And they, in other words, it seems to me that Putin and Netanyahu are in similar positions. They are surrounded on their borders by enemies who are actual Nazis who want to kill their people, and they're fighting back, and both are being accused of genocide. Putin has often been called genocidal. He's been called a war criminal. The ICC wants him, It's the same thing that I see happening to Netanyahu. What do you think?
Yeah, all the rhetoric that was used against Russia.
Yep.
Russia is a Nazi state, genocidal, brutal war, blah, blah, blah. It's all being used against Israel. You may be right that they may be throwing Israel under the bus. For
I hate to see that, though.
But, this really actually is not a serious hearing. There are no real consequences to, whatever they come up with.
That's true. It's non-binding legally.
Yeah, it's non-binding. It's just they're just gonna give an opinion about how whatever is going on may affect international law. And then it'll have to go to the Security Council is the only one that can decide anything. And yeah, so it's not even that important. So it's a kangaroo court. It's a play.
A show trial.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This has been a Maverick Multimedia production.